Oh, it's a 30 kilometers. Should take around. Yeah, that's it. No, that's good. What? Oh, you pay 20 kilometers on the export carriage. Then take it. You didn't say the same thing, right? Yeah. For you listen. You won't listen. What we did, Jesus is very true. I guess of course, everybody, I know you're not be able to get it. To him, I tell. Oh, yeah, it's fine. Hello. Ashoka. Former. I'm also. I'm on the edge. So he's always on the edge.
We have met. Probably do not.
Actually, we have met when we were last.
Yes. So there is for 10 years.
Yes.
I come from the
Yeah.
But you brought the reins here.
I brought reins, I tell one story of rain in Mumbai. I came here because so people asked me. Yeah. And now finally today it's there. And meanwhile, I heard that Delhi is going through that.
Yeah.
visiting positions at ISI Delhi, JNU and MDI Gurgaon. His research interests are in the areas of finance, macroeconomics, and public economics. He's published well in a lot of journals, but he also writes extensively for a leading newspaper, Business Standard. So today he's going to be presenting his work titled Towards a Well-Targeted Interest Rate Policy. So Professor Gurbachan, you have about 45 to 50 minutes to present your work. If you want, you can take up clarificatory questions in between. There will be about 20 or 25 minutes for discussion post that. Over to you.
Thank you. So, a formal thanks to the Institute and most specifically Bharti and Sargam for organizing this. Very glad to be here again, second time. So this is on towards a well-targeted interest rate policy. So output losses in a macro financial crisis vary between 3 and 33%. In other cases where output losses are not huge, there is an ongoing side effect on interest incomes, asset prices, and pension funds, partly due to instability and partly due to policy. And that's the aspect that I am concerned with here. This presentation is looking at a long-standing macroeconomic policy problem. An important part of that policy is the interest rate policy. So I'm here focusing on the interest rate policy only. Though there is some novelty in the basic economic principles used here, the changes in policy and the institutional setup that emerge are substantial. So this is to say upfront that it is going to be needing a different setup. Prevailing interest rate policy intervention is in an important sense, and I'll clarify a little later. It is actually opaque, not very, and of course we know it's not very effective for macroeconomic stability because of the trade-offs that are faced, and it is blunt and relatively large size. It is blunt in the so it's blunt in the sense that it affects interest incomes, asset prices, and pension funds. Okay. I'm going to propose an alternative interest rate policy, which is the transparent, effective, relatively much well targeted, and small size. So the literature and this paper, there have been impressive advances in macroeconomics that include the TSE models, also related Hank and other such models. However, after a point, advances, generalizations, greater details, and the pressure to be up to date within a paradigm can become a burden for innovation. This paper considers policy afresh. The analysis here is very simple, but very different. It builds on my earlier work, and one of these two papers was actually presented here at IGIEDR some 9-10 years back. That was on dealing with the zero lower bound on the interest rate. Some more on the literature, Jean and Korinek, 2010-2019, but there are other papers as well, used a tax subsidy scheme to correct for externalities in macroeconomics. This paper uses a tax subsidy scheme to correct for random causes in macroeconomics. And I'll come to what I mean by that. This approach, what it does, it gives a new additional policy tool. The idea is to deal with the issue of paucity of policy tools with which you can deal with macroeconomic instability. So this paper revisits the classic Tinperjan 1952, the paucity of policy tools, the adequacy of or inadequacy of policy tools relative to the number of objectives that you have. So with that policy tool, I, in a very simple way, generalize the ISMP model and the ISLM model and the Taylor rule. What this does is it gives a policy that is effective and without side effects. So there are two things here, effectiveness and side effects.
Random positive, random short.
I'm clarifying, I'm coming to that. So before that, just a chart on the federal funds rate in the US. So as you can see, there are considerable fluctuations. Part of it is market driven, but a big part is actually driven by policy. So if you ask the Fed or other central banks, then they would say that we have to do this in the interest of macroeconomic stability, which is indeed true. However, these changes in the interest rate affect interest incomes, asset prices, and pension funds. So the issue is whether you can have macroeconomic stability without adverse effects for the financial sector. So scope of the presentation here, I will abstract from short-term and long-term interest rate. I'll abstract from interest inelasticity of investment and relatedly Keynesian fiscal policy, which is not to say that fiscal policy in general is absent, and that will become clear what I mean by that. Asymmetric use of policy over an economic cycle under the prevailing policy regime. So under the prevailing policy, there's a tendency to be more active in a recession than in an unhealthy boom. But I will abstract from that stylized fact and assume symmetry here. And I'll also abstract from the zero lower bound on the interest rate. So asset prices, again, I'll abstract from factors like sentiment. So this presentation will touch on asset price instability only to the extent that it is a consequence of the prevailing interest rate policy, which is again the issue of side effect of the central bank policy. So I have a forthcoming book which relaxes on these assumptions. So it's only this presentation which is limited in scope here. So the plan of the presentation here is 4 parts here: the context and the way forward briefly, then towards full employment, given low and stable inflation in that section. But then in the next section, section 3, towards full employment and low and stable inflation, both together. And open economy briefly if time permits. So the context and the way forward. So the next slide will explain what is the meaning of random cost, but at the moment, what is the role that it's playing? Random causes is a term that was used in Slutsky way back in 1937. And then it was revived by Ramey in 2016 in the Handbook of Macroeconomics. And I have taken it forward from there. So what these random causes do is that they cause volatility in important relative prices. These prices include interest rate, exchange rate, oil price, and food price. Now, oil price and food price, 2 of these are familiar in the context of the distinction between core inflation and CPI inflation. However, here it is considering not just that aspect of inflation, but also the effect of these fluctuations on output. So how do they affect output? So if you have random causes which cause volatile prices, these volatile prices, they can become weird prices, outlier prices, and they can depress animal spirits and cause high perceived uncertainty. And these in turn cost low real investment, which costs with a multiplier significantly low output given sluggish price level. What is to be noted here is that real investment is not exogenously unstable. It is endogenous. Animal spirits are also not exogenous. They are endogenous. They are in turn a function of volatile prices of these important relative prices. And the other part is that as in this note, no contradiction between volatility of important relative prices and sluggish behavior at the general price level. It's the latter which gets attention in macroeconomics. The earlier bit, it does get attention in one sense. There's a lot of talk about it, but when it comes to both theory and practice, at the end of the day, we are rather silent about it. Again, it is rooted in the paucity of policy tools. How much can you do anyway? Next, volatile price is a case of mispricing. So if you have oil price which goes up considerably and then comes down considerably, then if long term it is say more or less constant, and indeed data shows that. If you leave out 1973, 1979, from 1980 onwards till now, for more than 40 years, if you take the real price of oil, it doesn't show any upward trend. it is a story of fluctuations in real price of oil. And what that says is that, well, international price of oil goes up and down. So you could take that data for 40 years, suggests that long-term real price of oil is more or less constant. If that is the case, then when it goes up and if it is mean reverting, then you can consider the excess high price as temporary and as mispricing. Similarly, when it is low price, it is temporary and it is mispricing. By temporary, I don't mean a day, a week, a month. It could be even a few quarters, but it shows mean reversion.
Relative price relative to overall price.
Relative to the overall price level, but relative to each other also. So all that I mean is that I'm not considering the general price level. So I'm considering the 4 prices and the general price level. So since I'm calling that price level general, I'm calling this relative. Not the volatility itself. So that also. No, the price itself is volatile. Or so there are 2 separate things. Prices are volatile, and they are volatile due to random causes. So what are the random causes? Just mayhem. So falling stocks gain rally and extending it a bit more. Random causes in macroeconomics include crop failures, sentiment in various markets, asset markets, currency markets, commodity markets, and market for funds, speculative and momentum trades, actions of public authorities, geopolitics, and commodity shocks. So you can see that there's a difference between the standard way in which the term shock is used and the way the term random cause is being used here. So random causes here are transitory, though not necessarily short-lived. These can last for months and even several quarters. So here is something about mispricing that I talked about earlier. So let me talk about the familiar part first before I come to the unfamiliar part. The familiar part is the case of externalities in public goods. And to some extent, it is also familiar in macroeconomics, externalities in macroeconomics, thanks to Gene and Koronek, a set of papers, besides these 2. So the idea in externalities is that, take an example, a factory emits smoke. The cost to the society due to the smoke is relevant information for the society, but it does not get incorporated in the price. So it is relevant information, but information that does not enter prices. So it is mispricing. Therefore, it needs a correction. And people taught us that you can correct it through a tax subsidy scheme. That is the benchmark, that is the starting point. Gene and Koronek said you can extend the concept of externalities from public economics to macroeconomics. So this an example they gave was if you have sudden and large capital flows, they can affect exchange rate, that can affect exports, the economy, various other things. So we call them externality. I'm considering the opposite case of that. Opposite in what sense? There you have relevant information, here you have irrelevant information. There you have information does not enterprise, here information enterprise. So what is happening here is that even though information is irrelevant, it is entering price. So this is a different case of mispricing. But the interesting part is that at the end of the day, both are cases of mispricing. So just as you can treat one mispricing with a tax subsidy scheme, similarly you can treat another mispricing with a tax subsidy scheme. The other 2 cases are cases of, you may call, market efficiency. Relevant information that does enter prices, irrelevant information that does not enter prices. So it is these 2 which Friedrich Hayek had in mind in his classic 1945 paper and other work where the importance was on prices as signals of scarcity, of utility, etc. Prices perform an important role in economics. That is when markets are efficient in these 2 categories. But otherwise, we have these 2 other cases of inefficiency.
market are efficient. They go for with the irrelevant. Can be temporary. But they will be important.
No, then that becomes a case of this box. But what I am doing is no. So you can think of small mispricing. You can think of large mispricing. Now here we are. Milton Friedman taught us that don't worry about fine tuning. That is very difficult to do. Which means small changes, small fluctuations, let them be. But here, so we are talking about significant mispricing, which needs to be corrected.
The market are huge. We're not responding to them.
No, so the general case is that in these two cases, markets are efficient. In these two cases, markets are inefficient.
Is that?
In case of externality, it is inefficient. And in case of random cause, it is also inefficient. It's a different kind of inefficient. So that is the generalization here. Okay. So this second section, so that was the context and the way forward from there. So the point is that, let's go back to the title of the paper. It is about towards a well-targeted interest rate policy. So there is interest rate is a price. If the market price is correct, nobody need do anything. But if there is mispricing in the interest rate, that needs to be corrected. But from that theory that we just learned, such mispricing can be corrected through a tax subsidy scheme. But when it comes to interest rate, when we see it in practice, we don't see a tax subsidy scheme by the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury making the correction. What we see in practice and what we have been seeing in practice is that the central bank is in charge of correcting the interest rate to the extent that it actually sets the short-term interest. Okay, so how can one reconcile the theory of correcting prices through a tax subsidy scheme with the central bank policy of setting the interest rate, which is actually a case of correcting the market price? So the way to reconcile it is as follows. So remember, this section is assuming low and stable inflation. So we can focus on the economic cycle, recession, normalcy, boom. I will not consider the case of normalcy, just recession and boom. So this slide is on recession. The next one is on boom. And what we have in the upper chart is the prevailing policy, and the next chart is on the proposed policy. So let me explain what is going on in the first chart.
Professor Singh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, this is Rajeshwari. I've joined virtually.
Yes.
So I have a clarification question. So when you're talking about interest rate policy, one of the primary objectives of having an interest rate policy, if at all, is to achieve low and stable inflation. But if you assume low and stable inflation, then you're taking away one of the most important policy objectives of having an interest rate policy, so to speak.
You are absolutely right, but that is happening only in this section. So in the next section, I'm considering both output and inflation.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
So here, let us understand the interest rate policy. So in a recession, this is the case of recession. In a recession, the central bank lowers the interest in order to encourage real investment. So you want to decrease the interest cost. So what is the central bank doing? By lowering the interest rate from the market level to a level which it has set, what it is doing is actually an implicit subsidy, which I'm calling a quasi-subsidy. The central bank is giving an implicit inbuilt quasi-subsidy to the borrowers for the purpose of real investment, so that real investment picks up and hopefully with a multiplier output picks up. So that is the part about if you see the column under borrowers and the row under real investment, that's a quasi-subsidy, which is what is intended. However, the interest rate policy is blunt, because if you lower the interest rate, then you have lowered it not just for the borrowers, you have also lowered it for the depositors, for the lenders, for pension funds, etc. So their interest incomes are being reduced. So it is as if you are imposing a tax on the interest income of the savers. So that's the other part about quasi-tax. in that row under real investment and the last column lenders or depositors. So you have a quasi tax subsidy scheme inbuilt, implicit in the central bank's interest rate policy. And that's the part about it being non-transparent, because what's happening is actually a tax subsidy scheme, and that's where it ties up with the theory of correcting market prices through a tax subsidy scheme, whether they are externalities or they are random causes. Completely? Yeah. Yeah, so one can go into details and say to what extent they are floating, to what extent they are fixed, how much they are effective. So I'm simplifying from that. So the point is that it affects some savers, let us say. Not all savers all the time, but some savers. But by the way, that if that may sound like being very defensive, low interest rate policy can last for very long. After the global financial crisis, the US has followed a low interest rate policy till a year and a half ago. So it was more than 1.5 decades that they had a low interest rate policy. So even if you don't go into details of fixed, floating now, then it is affecting a whole lot of people for very long. So next, come to the case of the other row, financial investment. So when the central bank lowers the interest rate, it wants people to set up factories. That is the idea, encourage real investment. But when you lower the interest rate, you are lowering the interest rate for financial transactions also. An example of financial transaction is that I borrow at low rates of interest and I invest in the stock market. Or a company borrows funds and uses the money for share buybacks. Again, that is lifting the price of the assets. So in both these examples, the effect of the low interest rate policy in these examples is not on real investment. No factory has been built, no employment has been generated. It is helping with financial investment, and it is increasing the profitability for a company or for an investor. So that's the other blunt part, that the policy is intended for real investment, but it affects financial investment as well. And the last row, last column in that first table, quasi-tax. So when I save, I don't even have the consolation that I'm getting a low interest rate because some factory is being set up. I am being paid a low interest rate on my fixed deposit because that money may be in part lent to somebody who's making a financial investment. So it is not a case of macroeconomic stabilization that we're familiar with from markets. Now, making a departure to what could be an alternative policy. Now, recognizing that the central bank's interest rate policy does include a tax subsidy scheme, though of a quasi nature, what we could do is to think in terms of a clear, transparent tax subsidy scheme, not by the central bank, but by the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury. That is what it is at the end of the day. Now, this is not just a change of form, and I will elaborate on how it is more than a change of form. It actually gives an additional policy tool with which you can handle the problem in a much better way. So if it is a clear subsidy scheme in a recession, then what you can do is give a clear subsidy to borrowers for the purpose of real investment. Don't give to borrowers who are investing in the stock market or who are buying back shares. And also, you don't impose any tax on the savers or the depositors. So with these three boxes being blank, what is being signified here is that this is a blunt policy affecting all four. Here is a well-targeted policy which is affecting only one. Now, of course, here, so far I have talked about the imposition of subsidy effect. But there is an incidence effect from public finance, as we know, but I'll come to that a little later.
I have a little question there. General macro is, what you described is fantastic. If there is what Keynes called in a very significant chapter, the state of business confidence. That's chapter 12, one of the central chapters of Keynes. Right? That happens, you can't really do anything like this.
Isn't that true? Because money is diverted in this kind of policy when lowering interest rate, precisely because there is no scope for making money in real investment. How do you respond to that? Because that state of business confidence is something that has been happening recently for quite some time.
Yeah, so this is the case of real investment being interest inelastic.
Right.
So at the beginning, I said that in this presentation, I'll abstract from interest inelasticity. But in the larger book that I have, and it's pretty large, I deal with that aspect. So here, because I'm dealing with the interest rate policy, so I'm assuming that real investment is indeed interest elastic. This is not my assumption. I don't have to defend it. I also don't believe in it. But it is, the fact is that the policy makers emphasize interest rate policy. So what I want to show is that the policies that you're emphasizing is actually not very effective and it has side effects, and we do need an alternative.
But how do you differentiate between the real investor and the financial investor that you're making here, in view of the fact that they might divert funds?
So it is,
Like they do share buyback and so on.
I am coming.
Okay.
Professor Singh, sorry, Rajeshwari, one more question, sort of related. So when you're making the distinction between real investment and financial investment, see, what I'm curious about is when entities are doing investment in financial assets, be it shares or bonds or whatever it is, these are assets, these are essentially instruments using which firms or companies are raising capital, be it from the bond market or from the stock market. And in turn, these firms are using the capital for doing investment. So how are you doing this compartmentalization between real investment and financial investment? Because the investment in financial asset is financing the investment in projects, etc.
Yeah. So what you have in mind is the primary market. If you're thinking of primary market, then think of real investment. Here, by this classification between real investment and financial investment, if you like, you can think of primary market here and secondary market here.
But even in the secondary market, right, the whole reason of secondary market is I'm able to trade in certain financial assets, which is adding liquidity to the market, which is actually helping the companies to get better pricing of their capital using which they're doing the investment. So this separation is not really very clear to me.
So you're absolutely right. And John Hicks had a very long story on that. So it is indeed true that it is the existence of the secondary market, which in the first place facilitates the primary market to be able to do anything at all. So that is very correct. That is in the context of the long run economic and financial development. In the context of short run macroeconomics, what I'm saying should do. So there isn't a contradiction between the two.
Okay.
So would you say that PLI scheme falls in this category?
No.
It's targeting only production.
No, but PLI scheme is in the context of long run economic development. It is not in the context of stabilizing macroeconomy. So India has had a long-term problem in manufacturing. So PLI scheme came in that context. It is not that we have a current slowdown which has to be dealt with, and therefore.
If you announce the PLI for 1 or 2 years and make it general, that was all. You will say that.
So if you do it for 1 or 2 years, and if you do it in the years of recession, and if you also commit yourself not to extending it thereafter, yes. So this was the case of recession. This is the case of boom, but it is the opposite of what we had in the previous case. So I'll skip this and move forward. So financing the subsidy. Now, of course, under the prevailing policy, it is straightforward because within a recession, there is an inbuilt tax subsidy scheme in the same period and exactly equal. So the question of financing doesn't arise because you're subsidizing somebody and you're taxing somebody. So the central bank doesn't even have to worry about any kind of deficit. The interesting story is in the case of proposed policy because in a recession, you only have a subsidy, but then in a boom, you only have a tax. So even though you have a deficit here, you have a surplus here. related to the interest rate policy. So intertemporally it balances out, more or less, broadly speaking. However, there is more happening here, which is that in the recession, the subsidy leads to a higher fiscal deficit. But as Keynes taught us, it is desirable that the government runs a higher fiscal deficit in a recession. So this subsidy and the higher fiscal deficit in a recession is not something that we have to be defensive about. This is in line with very standard macroeconomics. Now, to the point of possible misuse. So, in the prevailing policy, there is a quasi-subsidy scheme. So here I've taken this case of recession, but one can take the other case as well. So here we have a quasi-subsidy for all real investment, and as I argued earlier, for all financial investment. This is by the very nature of the scheme, by design, by law. Now come to the case of proposed policy, where it is intended for all real investment, but there may be some misuse. So possibly some financial investment. Now, when you compare this with that, you have all real investment here, you have all real investment here. You have all financial investment here, you have possibly some financial investment here. So even if there is some misuse, this is less than that. The proposed subsidy is less than the prevailing subsidy. So it is not only better targeted, it is small size. So this should help. This is a standard framework that we use. So this is the standard ISNP model. I'll come to the ISLM version also. So here we have the horizontal MP curve and the standard downsloping IS curve, and you have equilibrium where the two intersect. So the equilibrium interest rate is R0, the equilibrium output is Y0, and let us assume that Y0 is full employment, the initial situation to begin with. Then with some random cause, the IS curve shifts inwards, and the equilibrium output is now Y1, but because the central bank is continuing to maintain the interest rate at R0, that does not change by policy. So it's a case of less than full employment, nothing else happening. But for the central bank to deal with this case with its interest rate policy, what it does is to lower the interest rate, take it down to the extent that you have an intersection with the revised shifted IS curve, so that you get Y2, which is equal to Y0, so that you are close to restoring full employment. Now here, of course, I've considered the simple case where you are back exactly to the full employment, but the point is that you are moving towards full employment. Now, so the policy is successful, the prevailing policy is successful in restoring full employment. Why is it successful? It's a case of one objective, which is dealing with output, and it has one policy tool, which is interest rate, so there is no issue, or so it seems. I'm saying that because having restored output to Y0, you've had to keep the interest rate at R2. The interest rate is lower. So the interest incomes are affected, asset prices are affected, pension funds are affected. So there is a side effect which is not considered usually in macroeconomics. So yeah, temporary. The example that I gave was after global financial crisis, the interest rate stayed low for more than 1.5 decades. 15 years is not a short time.
That's it specific to specific shop probably and specific to very specific to this.
But so yes, you are right.
Such a long term, you can always change.
No, but
You always
also,
time your assessment.
also choose that, about 10 years back, or a dozen years back, the standard fixed deposit interest was in double digits. Now, is saying that it's a very high interest rate, but then normally it is 5 to 6%. I think very decent. What about a dozen years back? The fixed deposit interest was 30%. That's the point, and that would affect some of the side effects very severely. Pension salary or pensioner and everything.
I should mention another factor. Yes. In a recession, the marginal utility income is very high. So what you're facing is a cut in interest income at a time when there is unemployment, at a time when output is low, when the job losses are there. So it's not even that the effect of a low interest rate policy gets cancelled out by the policy of high interest rate and a boom. Also combined with the fact that the policy is not used very symmetrically. Policymakers are a lot more active in a recession, but in a boom, in an early boom, they're not very active. Take the classic example of 2003 to 2008. The policymakers said boom, chalne do. So, so the boom continues, the recession you deal with. So, it doesn't even cancel out.
But there is also the Japanese case of negative. I mean, that has affected a lot of people for a very long time. The entire, it was called a lost decade and so on and so forth. Short term can be very drastic for those economies.
That's a good industry.
Yeah, but you put money in
Now,
a bank.
industry are.
I was told to speak for limited. Okay, I think that's maybe better. Then the picture will become clearer. Okay, so so as we know, there is a market rate of interest and there is the neutral interest rate. Market rate can be same as central bank interest rate if the central bank does enough to keep the market rate where it wants it to be. So I'll not make that distinction. But when the central bank wants to ensure full employment, it lowers the interest rate to R2. R2 is the low neutral interest rate in a recession. Now, that policy, what it does is it's trying to bring the interest rate to the low neutral interest rate in recession, which is a good thing, which is of course what you need. But what you can do is to use an alternative policy. Why do you need an alternative policy? Because here you not only reduce the interest rate for borrowers for real investment to R2, you lower it for everybody, which is the blunt part. So let me come to the alternative policy. So in this, as I argued earlier, you can have a clear subsidy scheme by the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance. And what it does is that it shifts the IS curve out. It doesn't touch the LM curve because the central bank is not the MP curve rather. So the MP curve stays where it is. With the subsidy on the interest cost, the effective interest rate for borrowing for real investment becomes R0 minus B. B is the subsidy. So what you have here is this intersection point is where you have the low neutral rate. That is also the effective, meaning post-subsidy interest rate for borrowers for the purpose of real investment. And as far as the others are concerned, for them, the interest rate has stayed the same. So it is a case of stability of interest rate observed in the market and variation of the interest rate, which is what is of concern for the borrowers of real investment. So the argument now in terms of the ISLM model, so you have the thick curves being the initial IS curve, the LM curve, the intersection R0, Y0, again assume that Y0 is the full employment level of output, and due to a random curve, the IS curve shifts inwards, and that gives you the new equilibrium, which is Y1, less than full employment, that's the recession, and the interest rate has moved down from R0 to R1. In this framework, the central bank does not set the interest rate, it changes the money. It increases the money, the LM curve shifts out. And with that expansionary monetary policy, output is restored to full employment or closer to full employment. So you achieved your objective. However, in the process, it is bad enough that interest rate has moved down from R0 to R1. Now by policy, it has been moved down further from R1 to R2. So it is affecting the savers, it is affecting financial investment. That's the blunt part of it. But if you use the proposed policy, then you don't use the expansionary monetary policy. Instead, you give a subsidy on the interest cost, which reduces the effective interest rate for borrowing for the purpose of real investment, which shifts the IS curve out. I've taken the simplified case here where it shifts all the way back to the original IS curve. And what you get is Y2 equal to Y0. So you restore full employment without affecting the interest rate observed in the market, or without affecting it much. So the new interest rate R2 is close to R0. Here it is taken equal to R0. So to the extent that you do have an incidence effect of a subsidy, as we learned from public finance, it moves to stabilizing the interest rate rather than destabilizing it, which is what happens under the prevailing cost.
I guess the highest is going down, it's a demand. So I really need to see the price. That will increase the needs.
No, remember in this section, I'm assuming low and stable inflation. So price stability assumed for the moment.
Prices are fixed.
You can, yes, price are fixed. So a bit of math will help, though very, very simple math. So this is the simplest version of ISLM model that I can put up here. The first is the IS curve, second is the LM curve. IS curve is savings equal to investment, savings as a function of income and interest rate, investment as a function of interest rate. And LM curve is exogenously given money equal to the demand for money depending on income and interest rate. You have two equations in two variables, Y and R. You solve them, and the equilibrium is the equilibrium level of output and interest rate. So that is the standard story. Now come to the revised and the generalized model. The second equation is the same as before for the LM curve. The IS curve, this is the same as before. Here I've made a modification. Investment is a function of just the interest rate, but here this is post-subsidy interest rate or post-tax in case of a home. So it is generalization in the sense that you are now including the new policy tool, which is a subsidy rate. So with that, for a given V, you again have two equations and two variables, Y and R. So you change the V, or in principle, you can also change N, which is the standard policy tool that we have in the context of the ISLM model. So you have two policy tools here. Here you have one policy tool. So what's going on? We are being able to stabilize the interest rate observed in the market. But how is that happening? What is it that is giving way? It came up earlier also, but to touch on it more explicitly, under the prevailing policy, we have considerable fluctuations in the interest rate, as I showed in the data chart at the beginning. So it is, yes, we have considerable fluctuations, and these are undesirable because they have side effects. Under the proposed policy, we don't have large fluctuations in the interest rate observed in the market. However, we have an increase in fiscal deficit and a reduction in fiscal deficit over an economic cycle. So the fluctuations are, in a sense, if you like, getting shifted there from there to here. But as I said earlier also, it is in fact good that the fiscal deficit rises in a recession and that it falls in a boom. So this is desirable, this is undesirable. Some economics and politics. Can an independent central bank more or less minimize political pressure in fixing quasi-tax subsidy rates? In principle, yes, and it's been a gradual change. It's not been very satisfactory, but we are moving in that direction. So we do have that institution. It takes the form of independent central bank. It also takes the form of an independent monetary policy committee in principle. So we have that in place already. In the context of the fiscal policy, we don't have the counterpart of that. But if you are to change a policy, then you need to consider institutional changes alongside to make it more meaningful. Sensible. So Here it is, what I did say earlier, but stated more compactly here. Consider a closed economy, assume that price stability holds, both the prevailing and the proposed interest rate policy are effective for maintaining margin. However, the prevailing policy intervention is non-transparent because it's quasi-tax subsidy. It is blunt because it affects savers and financial investment. And it is large size. This is related to the fact that it is blunt. In contrast, the proposed policy intervention is transparent. You're calling it tax, you're calling it subsidy. And it is in principle well targeted or better targeted than the prevailing policy. And it is small size related to the fact that it is better targeted. So here itself, the proposed policy scores over the prevailing policy. So next, allowing for instability in the inflation rate, so towards full employment and low and stable inflation. What if we have both objectives? So I'm abstracting here from cost push inflation, fiscal theory of the price level, and inflation due to political economy conflicts. So this is a simpler story of inflation here. It will help to have this chart because it is about we teach this in standard undergraduate programs. Prevailing policy, monetary policy target, indicator, interim target, instrument. So there we have two objectives in a closed economy: price stability and full employment. Indicator or interim target is the interest rate, but to write it in the language that I talked about, this involves the use of a quasi-tax subsidy scheme, and the instrument is open market operation. In popular language, of course, what is said is that the interest rate is a policy tool. So it's referring to the second one, interest rate as a policy tool. Here, of course, in monetary economics, we make these distinctions. Now let's come to the proposed policy. So what I'm saying is that the monetary policy could target just price stability, not full employment. But this is not to say that the objective of full employment is to be left out. What is happening is that because we have a different policy tool, which is an additional policy tool, what you have is a clear tax subsidy scheme to affect the interest rate and give a push to real investment and to restore full employment. So that is just getting shifted from there to here. Why do you want to do that? Because there, now remember, in this case, we have two objectives and one policy tool. So there is a paucity of policy tools. The central bank faces a trade-off. Here, because you have two policy tools and you have two policy objectives, you don't face that trade-off. So this makes it effective in dealing with price instability. It makes it effective in dealing with less than full employment. Now, what the change here is that the indicator or interim target is not the interest rate. Instead, it is central bank money. And this is the same open market operations under both the prevailing and the proposed policy. Accommodative role towards. I'm coming to that. So I'm making a distinction between trade-off in policy and interdependence in policy. So there is continuing to be an interdependence in policy, but no trade-off. So here the emphasis is that there is no trade-off because you don't have a paucity of policy. But yes, there is interdependence, and I'm coming. Government increasing the
investment by providing a subsidy.
yes.
So I want this
That's a standard Keynesian fiscal policy. Yes. No. So I am more than happy to go along with that. But the moment you talk to people about using fiscal policy, they keep saying that no, we have the central bank for stability. So what I'm saying is that if you must emphasize the central bank policy for stabilization, then this is what central bank is actually doing. And if they are doing that, then that particular part can be done in a better way. So I am not advocating an interest rate policy. I am just saying there is a better interest rate policy compared to what you are doing at the moment. A little louder, I'm missing some.
Then we understand the effect.
No, so
But again, the real side.
no, so here actually the point is that you can let the interest rates be what they are in the market. But as we know, the market determined interest rates may not be appropriate. And as Pigu taught us and Jane and Koronek subsequently later, then there is mispricing, including mispricing in the context of interest rate, which is nothing but a price. Then you use the standard tax subsidy scheme, either as a quasi tax subsidy scheme or as a clear tax subsidy scheme. One being more than a substitute of the other because it is giving you better returns. So those, the issues that are faced by the central bank are the ones which are going to be faced partly by the independent advisory body, which is advising on the interest rates. So it is not that a new problem has been created. It's just that the information requirement has shifted partly from the central bank to the treasury or the ministry. But so here is Taylor rule. So this is the standard format Taylor rule. This version is from Romer 2012. So I is the real interest rate set by the central bank. Rn is the neutral interest rate, and the gap is a function of the gap in the inflation gap, which is the gap between the actual inflation and the optimal or targeted inflation rate, and similarly the gap between the actual output and the natural output. So this is standard. I haven't changed this at all. In this equation, the right-hand side is as it is. I haven't changed it. As you can see, it's the same. I'm just writing the left-hand side in a more elaborate way to tie it up with the way I am interpreting the monetary policy, which is that what is monetary policy? It is change in central bank money and quasi-tax subsidy scheme on the interest rate by the central bank. So it is just rewriting. I haven't changed. But what is the point of rewriting? I'm coming to that. But here in this simplified form, I've written pi, but you can also write pi as a function of y so that you have allowed for that dependence of inflation on now. Now, here is the change. The change is that instead of that one equation in a rule, I am splitting it up into two parts. One part is the inflation part, the other is the output part. The inflation part to be tackled by the central bank, the output part to be tackled by the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance. I've split up that one right-hand side into two parts, and here the central bank money, delta BP comes from base money as it is called. I prefer to use the term central bank money, but that aside, why the change in the name. So that is that part, and here the interest rate policy is including a tax subsidy scheme. So if we are under the proposed policy, then it's a clear tax subsidy scheme to affect the interest rate in the context of borrowing for the purpose of real investment. That subsidy notation, if you recall, was so we have this. Now, as of now, it is a simplified way of doing it. Even you can call it simplistic, but I'm making it better now. But before I improve on that, I'm just rewriting that. So I've deleted the sentences and I have just changed in central bank money as a function of the inflation gap, the subsidy as a function of the output. So that's the two parts modified or generalized Taylor rule, if you like, in the context of the proposed policy. But let's allow for interdependence, what you were talking about. And one part of the interdependence is again, just that pi depends on output, so you can write that. It doesn't affect. The other part is that the central bank, in deciding on the quantity of money that it is going to change, it will have to keep in mind what the Ministry of Finance is doing regarding the subsidy, because that subsidy is going to affect the interest rate observed in the market, and they'll have to keep in mind that when they are changing the quantity of money. Similarly, the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance, when it decides on the subsidy, it will have to keep in mind what the central bank is doing about the change in money, because that is going to affect the interest rate. So there is an interdependence. But note one thing, whether you take that set of equations or you take the more realistic set of equations, in either case, we have two equations and two variables, policy variables, which is the change in money and the subsidy. If you have two equations and two variables, you don't have a paucity of policy tools. You don't have a trade-off in principle. So here is what I'm saying, interdependence and policy, yes, between the central bank and the ministry. But in principle, no trade-off. So that is going back to Gurbachan, seeing how many objectives you have and how many policy tools you have. Which are the other two variables? No, so this is a parameter given. This is the observed known actual inflation. This is the observed actual output. This is the given parameter. So the policy variables, yes. No, I am not having that. So, you write this as pi of y. Okay, so you have a known pi and you have a known relationship between pi and y. So you have the whole thing known. So yes, and that is what I'm allowing. I'm allowing for the interrelationship between observed variables. And having observed at the end of the day, what is the inflation, what is output, as a policy maker, I have to decide on delta B and B. So it is another form of interdependence. That is true. So one form of interdependence is that each of the institutions has to take into account what the other is doing. The other part of interdependence is that it's this pi, which is observed, is an outcome of what the output in the market is. So there is a relationship, but when you write that pi as a function of y is observed. So you will get a pi from there. So pi is observed. So which is why I've written it more simply, because this clutters up things. So I must stress, if there is some discomfort, at the end of the day, the presentation is simple, but the economics is not simplistic. It requires some work to come to this. So, sometimes we get so much of elaborate models that when something is said rather simply, you start developing doubts about the whole thing being simplistic. There's a difference between simplistic and simple. This is not simplistic economics. This is simple economics. But at the end of the day, it is simple. It was not simple when I started doing it. Okay. Consider a closed economy. The prevailing interest rate policy is not very effective because you face a trade-off. Because you have one policy tool, two objectives. This is standard stuff that we learn from textbooks. This is in principle not true under proposed policy because we have two policies, two objectives, two policies. That's where the 10% problem is being confronted. Also, the prevailing policy is non-transparent, blunt, and large size, as I explained earlier. So that applies here also. The proposed policy intervention is transparent and is in principle well targeted and small size. So the thing is that the prevailing policy tends to not worry about interest income, pension funds, asset pricing. And they have a point. They say that if we start worrying about that also, then we'll have to compromise on output and inflation. And if we have to compromise, we would rather compromise on asset prices, interest income, pension funds rather than output and inflation. So they have a point. Given the policy tools that they have, they are absolutely right. But what I'm saying is that think of an alternative regime where you do have an alternative policy tool. Then you need not compromise on macroeconomic objectives in taking care of the financial objectives.
But in your proposed model, are you not assuming that full employment is not, you're not looking into full employment and GDP growth? You're looking at price stability along with the other ancillary issues. But what about you? Are you leaving out the employment and output?
I am not leaving out the output part because I'm leaving out the output part from the central bank, but not from somebody else is
some
taking
other agency is
taking care of it. Yes.
But both, so therefore, both of
Yes. Yes.
that's okay.
Yes. Okay. So this is open economy. Bharti, Bharti, can I take up this section or move to conclusion?
10 minutes.
I have 10 more minutes.
Yes.
Okay. So then we use this section.
Taking a question.
Okay. Okay. So let's take the. But before I explain this chart, let me say what Jean and Koronek had to say. So recall that I mentioned earlier that Jean and Koronek talked about sudden and volatile international capital flows affecting exchange rate, affecting the economy, and they viewed that as externalities to be dealt with through a tax subsidy scheme. So their argument was that if there are sudden and large capital inflows or sudden and large capital outflows, then what the Treasury, the Ministry of Finance can do is to use a tax scheme in a calibrated way to discourage these sudden inflows, sudden outflows, because they are causing externality in the economy. So that part is due to them. What I have done is to go a little more into the causes of the mispricing. And I'm saying that one cause of mispricing can take the form of it being externality, but it can also take the form of a random cause, which is causing mispricing. But either way, you can use a tax subsidy scheme to deal with volatile sudden international capital. Now, so that is the other tax subsidy scheme, which is used as a policy tool to deal with the problem of macroeconomic instability in an open economy. Now let's put the pieces together with what was done earlier in the presentation with what is now being suggested for the proposed policy for the open economy. But before I come to the proposed policy, let's just look at the prevailing policy. So under the prevailing policy, the key policy tool is the interest rate. But as we know, in an open economy, the central bank has another policy tool, foreign exchange reserves. So you can vary them, you can reduce them, increase them. So you would rather have fluctuations in the foreign exchange reserves and stable exchange rate rather than unstable exchange rate and stable foreign exchange rate. So that's a policy tool that you have, which you can use.
So therefore, we are not having full capital consumption.
No, so you talk about India.
I'm telling you, in the model, we are going with full capital consumption. In which case, if the excess full capital
No, so full capital account convertibility means that you have freedom of capital movement. But that can mean unstable exchange rate. Therefore, you use a policy tool to stabilize the exchange rate under the prevailing policy. That's what But the issue is that we have three objectives, which is price stability, full employment, and exchange rate stability. But you have two policy tools, which is interest rate and foreign exchange reserve. So even though you do have an additional policy tools, you still have the issue of paucity of policy tools because it is now two tools for three objectives under the privilege. So this is in principle. This is assuming that the policymakers actually use the foreign exchange reserves wisely. They change them. I'm not going into the issues of how effective it is, what they actually do versus what is expected of them. That let's leave that aside. This is about basic principles under one policy regime and under another policy regime. So let's come to this. So as I said, under the proposed policy, the central bank varies the money that it issues to maintain low and stable inflation. So that is the monetary policy tool. The Treasury or Ministry of Finance uses two clear tax subsidy schemes. One to affect the interest rate, which is what I talked at length about, and the other is in the context of the exchange rate, which is similar to what Jean and Koronek talked about, but not exactly the same. So here you have a story of three policy objectives, three policy tools. So again, handling the Gurbachan problem of being able to achieve your policy objectives. So what about deficits in the budget due to the tax subsidy schemes? So you can have, there are two schemes, one for the interest rate, the other for the exchange rate. So you can have a deficit, surplus, surplus. Now, this is of course fine. This can more or less, for simplicity, cancel out in a sense, broadly speaking. What you have is deficit, which may worry some of us, but to the extent that the twin deficit, if I may call it, to the extent that these two deficits are related to a recession, as I said earlier, it is desirable that you have a deficit in a recession. But of course, it need not always be the case of a recession. It could be outside of a recession as well, in which case it can be a concern in that year. But intertemporally, it's not that every year you have deficit. So some years you have deficit, another year it could be surplus, or some mix of the two. So that's not a serious issue here. So monetary trilemma. Let's look at that. We're all familiar with the issue of three things not being possible together. Which are the three things? So that is in the context of the prevailing policy: exchange rate stability, monetary policy oriented towards domestic goals, freedom of international capital movements. So the standard textbooks teach us that we can't have all the three together. And it is indeed true. I'm not disputing that. You can't have all the three together. But what you can do alternatively is that modify and see where you can get. So the first one, retain as it is, exchange rate stability. By that, I don't mean fixed exchange rate regime, flexible exchange rates, but stabilize the policy. How it's coming? So monetary policy oriented towards domestic goals, qualify that to monetary policy and tax subsidy scheme oriented towards domestic goals. So as I argued earlier, you have another policy tool here. So if you have another policy tool, then that can become part of this last column. So you don't have just monetary policy, you also have another fiscal policy, non-Keynesian fiscal policy. And that you can use for domestic goals, which is what I was talking about in those other precepts. And here, freedom of international capital movements subject to tax subsidy scheme. Now, it may be argued that I am restricting capital movement. So is it surprising that I'm getting a different result? Well, in a sense, yes, I'm diluting that idea of free capital movements. But think for a moment, is freedom of capital movement desirable Now, let me give you an analogy. In a capitalist economy, in a market economy, in a mixed, even in a mixed economy, as people taught us, you have the freedom of enterprise, yes. But if a factory emits smoke, then the freedom of enterprise is subject to a correction for the externalities by a tax subsidy scheme by the public authority. So freedom of enterprise is not desirable in the sense that somebody can set up a factory and emit smoke and affect the health of the other people. So it is not in the first place, unrestricted freedom of enterprise is not what we want. Even in the hardest core capitalist economy, even aside mixed economy. So now, as Jean and Korenik said, certain capital flows cause externality. So they're similar to factory emitting smoke. So just as you don't want complete freedom of enterprise, similarly, you don't want complete freedom of capital movement. So what may look like a restriction on freedom is actually a corrective mechanism that we have here. And when you do that, with those changes, all the above three are possible. Now, I've had to be very brief in this section, but in the previous section, I showed through two equations and two variables. Similarly, you can do it such an exercise for three equations, three variables, and you can have all the three together. Not all those three together, that I take, that's conventional wisdom is correct. But this changed part. So some extension, but I'll skip this slide. It will take long to just discuss this. Except to mention that zeroed over bound, I have dealt with that. And in fact, I have presented that this very institute itself earlier. So concluding remarks, the proposed policy is very different from the prevailing policy. We may call it innovative or a return to policy based on basic well-accepted economic theory. I've used very standard public finance. I've used very standard macroeconomics. So, but of course, it has led to a very different conclusion. Which is what I also was getting surprised at after going through the analysis where it was leading. But that's where it does. So the case for the proposed policy, of course, there is no empirical evidence in favor of the proposed policy. It is different, it is new, so there cannot be empirical evidence. But we do have empirical evidence that goes against the prevailing policy. So the opportunity cost of shifting is low. And the other part is there is nothing more practical than a good theory. So if you have a good theory to back you up on what can be the possible outcomes alongside evidence that the prevailing policy is not working, then there's something in favor of the proposed policy. Now, of course, it requires some change in laws by the parliament. It requires some change in the institutional setup that we have. That may seem a big change, but remember that economic principles cannot be changed. So relative to that, this is an easier change to ask for to stabilize the economy. Next, there are two different issues: paucity of policy tools and scarcity of resources. Now, sometimes some people think that you're talking about being able to get away from a trade-off, but in economics, all the time we're dealing with a trade-off. So how can it be that you can avoid a trade-off? Now, there's a confusion in that bit. So they're right to some extent, but where they're right is different from what I'm talking about. So if you have the production possibility frontier, standard microeconomics 101, so there, if you have a choice between guns and butter with limited resources, if you want more guns, then you have to have less butter. That trade-off is something you cannot get away from. In fact, that's what economics of scarcity is all about. But the paucity of policy tools is a different issue. If you can think of alternative policies, then you can minimize the trade-offs, if not eliminate them. So here it is a case of minimizing these trade-offs for policymakers, not minimize the trade-off between guns and butter, which is inescapable. Next, this is something that I mentioned earlier. Interest rate policy is not what I'm advocating it, and it is not a panacea. And the point is not that it should include a subsidy or a tax. That is happening anyway. It's just that we are not calling it that. It is happening non-transparent. So that is happening anyway. A better alternative is we propose interest rate policy intervention, which is best. The P standing for better targeted, E effective, and S small size, and T transparent. Believe me, I have not tried to do things in order to get this acronym. I was lucky in this last part. It worked out very well. So that's what we have, and thank you so much.
I completely see where you are coming from the regular side, speaking to tax subsidy tax. Very well appreciated for being that. Okay, my issue is a little different. It is true that the interest rate policy is also its strength.
It's also
Its strength in the sense that we have a money market. We have markets that function with high frequency, where the information coming out from that to the second banks. And because of these liquid markets, it's a little easier to figure out when and how much an interest rate is. While it's true that there is a tax and a subsidy that is underlying it. Why don't you fiscal side? What are you observing for you to take this? Okay. If on the monetary side I make a mistake, the mistake is usually reversed. On the fiscal side, I would have to decide on an amount, so many rupees crores have to be given in some. Let us forget about the problem of keeping the subsidy goes. Maybe I don't know how that can be solved, but maybe there is a potential in how that can be solved. But remember, on the budget side, when you start saying I'm going to have a subsidy, there will have to be an amount that is budgeted. It is hard enough on the monetary side to figure out timing and amount of the interest rate action that is required. That is why you have a whole issue to set up of intelligent people who stick together and take tasks. Now, on this side, when you're going to come to an amount of money, let's abstract from the problem of.
So, as I said, at one time, we had this issue even with central banks. Before we had monetary policy committee, before we had independent central bank, when we had the old style central banking, this problem arose. Now, of course, over time, expertise was required. So the central banks started hiring more and more PhDs, economists, financial people, etc., to solve that problem. So over time, we have broadened and strengthened the institution of the central bank and made it also independent. On top of an independent central bank, we have monetary policy committee, which is independent. So as of now, given the prevailing policy, we didn't need such a structure alongside fiscal policy. But as I said, that's why I was talking about policy change and institutional change. So at the moment, we don't have the counterpart of an independent monetary policy committee. We don't have the counterpart of an independent central bank. But if you change the policy and alongside change the institutional setup, let me give you one example, which we already have actually, so in a different context. Take the case of Finance Commission. Every 5 years, the Finance Commission has these experts, and they have this mandate to decide on the center-state division of resources. And I would say, by and large, it has worked well across a whole lot of governments. Now, of course, that kind of an institution cannot perform the kind of function that I'm talking about. But I'm just giving an analogy, an example. So similarly, if it is to be a policy change, it will require an institution change. So you could think in terms of an independent
advisory body, independent, consisting of independent experts who, and a standing independent advisory committee, which advises, and the advice is more or less mandatory, as it happens in the case of the Monetary Policy Committee and in the case of the Finance Commission. So there are ways of doing it. They are not in place as yet because we didn't need them. That is not required under prevailing policy. That is required only under the proposed policy, and it is something that has to be done. Which is why I was stressing that it does require a big change, but economic principles you cannot change at all. So therefore, it's a much easier change. A change in institutions, a change by parliament. These are man-made. Laws by parliament are man-made. Laws of physics, laws of economics are not man-made. They are natural. We can't change them. We may as well accept and devise our institutions according to it.
Yeah, I have a general question trying to understand. Quite like this. We're trying to bring in the second instrument of the speech there by saying that forget about the general Keynesian budget deficit surplus, fiscal deficit and all that. Bring in the Pigouvian tax subsidy stuff. Whatever happens to be the outcome in the budget, immaterial, but you are meeting this target. There is a monetary policy. The fiscal policy here is taken care of by the merit and demerit kind of thing. The Pigouvian taxes and subsidies. That will take care of this. And the Ministry of Finance, we are not talking about the institutions at all here. But on top of that, maybe there is a budget to help poor people, because this may not take care of the poor, okay? And other needy and developmental. That's a different thing. But you can talk about a monetary policy which is there, but the instrument that you're bringing in is based not on the Keynesian general deficit or surplus, but a Pigouvian tax subsidy. Is that what it is? I'm trying to understand.
Yes and no. Yes and no. So it is yes in the sense that people talked about the tax subsidy scheme to correct pricing.
Right.
But that was in the context of externalities.
Yes.
But here, I began with making a distinction between mispricing due to externalities and mispricing due to random causes. So I'm saying that here, again, you can use the tax subsidy scheme, which looks similar to the Pigouvian tax subsidy scheme. It is similar, it is in fact the same insofar as it is correcting a mispricing. But it is different in the sense that it is tackling a random cause, not an externality.
Right, but I have one problem. I mean, assume, and I have asked that question. You said somewhere at the beginning that you endogenize the animal spirits, said that in this model. But if the missing element, or the random element, the animal spirits, how do you take care of that by the Pigouvian tax subsidization?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is that animal spirits can be completely exogenous, or they can be in part exogenous, part endogenous. So I was not saying that they are entirely endogenous, but they are endogenous to the extent that they are affected by volatile currency. So suppose the exchange
That
rate
can't be called, if endogenous, that can't be called animal spirits, can it be? In terms of actual meaning of that.
no, in fact, that is what I'm saying. That the standard textbook treatment is that animal spirits are exogenous. They are exogenous or endogenous depending on the context. And the context that I'm giving is that if suppose the dollar is 80 rupees, suppose it suddenly becomes 110, 130, 150, or something of that sort has happened in Sri Lanka and Pakistan and elsewhere. Now, what is that sudden huge movement in the exchange rate going to do? It will lower the animal spirits of the businesses. They are not going to invest under those circumstances. So it is not that suddenly they woke up in the morning and they said, today morning I am feeling low, my animal spirits are low. It's not that. They wake up, they get up in the morning, they see the newspaper, they see that the dollar is at 150, now they're feeling low. So the low animal spirits in this context are not exogenously given, they are endogenous. It's a function of the volatile price, which has gone too far, it looks weird to you when you say, I can't take a decision under these circumstances.
So the no part of your answer, what I'm saying is, first part is the second instrument that you use the pigment. But how do you take care of it?
No, so it is
I'm trying to understand.
it is resembling Pigouvian tax, but it is different to some extent because Pigouvian tax is in the context of externality. This is in the context of random cost, which is a different kind of disturbance.
Two questions. One is your scheme to the opening part. Correct exchange.
So that is more to do Gene and coordinate. I don't want to take the credit. I can take enough credit for the interest rate part.
Situation where you want to put tax, is that the Tobin tax?
Tobin tax? No, it's not a Tobin tax. Tobin tax is it's often small and it is often regular. Whereas here it is occasional and it can be large. Though not suddenly large, it can be calibrated. So I have a feeling that Tobin had in mind what Gene and Kornick talked about later in 2010, 2019. But the way it went was that he said it or others took it like that because taxes are usually they are in place, they are regulars, they are there or they are not there. This is not saying that. This is saying that as and when you have sudden and volatile capital flows, you invoke that tax or subsidy, and if it doesn't work, you raise the rates. You change the rates in a calibrated way.
The calibration is actually either for positive or negative.
Yeah. So by the way, this kind of calibration is what the central bank does under the prevailing policy. So it says, I'm going to change the interest rate by a quarter, and then says, oh, it hasn't quite worked. I'll change it by another quarter, or by even 0.5%. Similarly, in foreign exchange reserve, they say, oh, I'm going to sell $25 billion to stabilize the market. And then they see, oh, it hasn't quite worked. So they say, well, another 30 or another 35. So they are doing that calibration. It's just that we don't see that calibration by the Ministry of Finance or the Treasury, we see it by the central bank.
So that was my second question. So if you have a certain tax long meters, a corporate tax or whatever. So well, if you have a kind of rebate or assist mechanism, the rate is adjusted. So in a recession, you give a rebate over that rate.
Yes.
Over the prevailing tax rate.
Yeah.
What you are saying is
yes. So there can be other tax subsidy schemes to be used over an economic cycle. This is one of them, but others could also work. I was talking about this because I was trying to say that what the central bank is actually doing is a tax subsidy scheme, and that is not a good way of doing it. If we have to do a tax subsidy scheme, then there is a better way of doing it.
Now, essentially, that takes care of whom to pay. So every tax-paying company would automatically benefit out of the tax.
No, so if it is the interest rate policy,
Saying you have the fiscal institution that you're saying, all it has to do is determine the rebate, the rate of rebate or the rate of sales.
so I would think of it in the context of real investment. So you will get the subsidy provided you set up a factory or you expand the factory or you modernize or you do something there, not otherwise. So it's not that in a recession, every factory, every company gets a subsidy.
Inflation and output. And there is no fiscal deficit.
And there is no?
Fiscal deficit as part of their policy.
Yes.
But your proposed fiscal deficit.
Yes.
So,
I
output cap target policy. I can understand it's superior to inflation target policy.
it is superior. I can definitely say that. Firstly, because it does not have side effects for interest income, that's a pension fund.
I understand.
No, no, but that is a big effect. Okay, that's a big effect first. Second, yes, it has implication for fiscal deficit, but remember what I said earlier, that in a recession, if you have a fiscal deficit, King said it is good that you have a fiscal deficit in a recession. It is
Somebody
good.
needs to pay for it, right? At some point.
Yes, so when there is a boom, the policy needs to be used as actively in a boom as it is used in a recession. So in a boom, then you impose a tax, so that you have an intertemporal tax subsidy scheme on the people.
Intra-temporal. With the interest.
Yes.
If you are just dividing into.
No,
today and
you're missing the basic point of Keynesian economics. Remember what Keynes said, that you have the paradox of thrift. There are people who are saving and there is nobody investing or very little investment. And you need somebody to borrow. So he said that it is good if the government is to borrow. Let's not forget that basic lesson. He wanted the government to borrow and to spend. So what I'm saying is that it can take the form of Keynesian fiscal policy. It can take the form of non-Keynesian fiscal policy.
there is another feature of money. Which is that
Okay.
whereas the fiscal.
No.
can compensate.
No, okay. So monetary, two things. So monetary policy, decision making is quicker. The effect is not quick. In fact, we have a big issue there. It's called the transmission of monetary policy. There's a serious issue there. In contrast, in fiscal policy, it is the decision making which is slow under the institutional setup that we have at present. But in another sense, fiscal policy is faster. Once a decision has been taken to spend, you don't have to worry about the transmission of the policy. When you spend, the effect is directly there. So it's a mixed story of comparison between one and the other in terms of the speed at which it works.
The transmission is slow.
It is better in the rest of the world, but it is not that it is absolutely smooth. So, in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, they lowered the interest rate, they said QE, etc. But they also had the fiscal plan because there's once you've taken a decision, it is immediate effect. Whereas here, by the way, there's another thing which comes up, which is not what we are talking about in this session, which is about the elasticity of investment to interest. A little louder. Yeah, a little louder.
So I just started, so just a comment. So started a paper saying that as random persons are temporary and
Temporary, so temporary. So the usual meaning of temporary is, a day, a few weeks, a few months. So here it can be longer than that. For example, the oil price, right? Yeah, the oil price can go up and stay up for quite some time, for several quarters, maybe even a few years. But in fact, I couldn't get over that chart. Once I looked at the inflation-adjusted price of oil for more than 40 years, it is almost constant. Yes, yes.
so I stabilize the cycle, and working macro policy, there was short term.
No, so I sorry to interrupt, but I am also looking at the short run. Long run, I mean, as I said in response to some question on PLI, etc., which was that long term is, long term development, long term growth rate, etc. But so the concern here also is short term. But short term can mean several quarters, a few years.
Business cycle, certainly a recession,
Yeah.
generally they have shorter than. So my expectation, I think, about the greatness of the idea of having this education committee and the regular is all about the demand management and short term. We're just managing the demand in the short term, not really creating the long term. So when it comes so and monetary policy has its practice. Like this poor policy and have money priorities also. Money priorities also. Long run we have and when it comes to fiscal policy, the timing and sense problems are more deeper as compared to monetary policy. So, for example, we were talking about the subsidy in the recession. So, it can happen by the time when it happens, we're already doing this. So, I'm not really comfortable with using this dynamic fiscal policy, stabilize the short-term fluctuations, stabilize the things. And as far as this crisis is concerned,
Just one word. So when you say,
okay. So as far as the financial crisis, you're talking about, so obviously, which is something to talk about, should be random, but
that view is not held by everybody.
Sorry.
That view is not held by everybody.
So I'm just saying that was an outlier in the sense that the whole, this natural rate of full employment level to talk about, it was a full trend shift. There was a lot of discussion about the trend itself going down. You know, it's like the move. So it's moving like this, the economy went down and the trend itself shifted. The whole buy-in, natural rate of unemployment and the trends we're talking about, the exception. So when the fiscal policy is there, it's not really just take care of the short term, it's also about the long run trajectory. So there the fiscal policy, I'm just thinking that how the tax and the subsidy over short-term policy will be more feasible, given that there are a lot of time expenses and it's not easy to cook. So if you look at the high frequency data for GDP in our country, it's a quarter. So they produce quarterly level of GDP data. They say like for 3-4 quarters, we want to change of this policy from tax bills. So I don't know whether it's more practical in nature. Even there's a lot of time lag.
So it seems to me that when you are saying fiscal policy, what you have in mind is Keynesian fiscal policy. Whereas here I am talking about non-Keynesian fiscal policy, which is an alternative to the inbuilt fiscal policy inside a monetary policy. So if you are comfortable with monetary policy, then you should be more comfortable with what I'm saying, because this is an improvement over there. I haven't talked about Keynesian fiscal policy at all here. I've abstracted from that. And what you have in mind is Keynesian fiscal policy, standard Keynesian fiscal policy. This is not that. No, so if real investment is interest inelastic, interest rate policy doesn't work. Then you have to have Keynesian fiscal policy. I did not discuss it here in this presentation. That is not to say that I think it is not important. Of course it is important. What is the feasibility? No. The moment you say the current regime, then you are saying that you're not changing anything. So if there is a policy change alongside an institutional change, then it is very feasible. If you say without an institutional change, is the change in policy possible? No, it is not.
Having this targeted policy, identifying the targeted groups.
But that is what the central bank is doing, or trying to do, or saying that it is doing. So I am not saying that the Treasury does anything more than what is being done at present. I'm only saying that instead of the central bank doing it, the Treasury does it because that is a better way of doing it.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you.